journalist workshop series on Indo-Pacific issues. In fact, we had a fairly good start day before yesterday with Shane Ruth, the political and economic chief of the US Consulate Hyderabad. He talked about the USIPS, that is the Indo-Pacific strategies, and touched upon the continuities and changes in the context, and talked about the importance of the US relations. So this actually was followed by a detailed and systematic presentation on security cooperation in the Indo-Pacific by Lieutenant General Prakash Menon, the former military advisor to the government of India, and laid down a detailed roadmap actually of India's strategic positioning in the Indo-Pacific region, and touched upon the critical aspects of China, Quad, Indian Ocean, ASEAN, and besides others. So, in fact, after getting a clear picture on security aspects, it's important to talk about the other two pillars, that is the economic cooperation and geopolitics. Yes. So, in fact, all three are interconnected, but still, it's important to understand things in detail on this thing. So to start the day's proceedings, may I request my senior colleague Kumaraguru to briefly welcome, without which we can't start.
Thank you, Sridhar, for those kind words. Good afternoon, everyone, friends, for joining us again for day 2 of this workshop. As Sridhar said, I think we had a great conversation on day 1, including the aspect that I liked about the shooting the general, where all of us had a chance to ask questions of General Menon. I've had the privilege of knowing him for a few years now, and including taking some of his sessions, attending rather some of his sessions, and I can tell you that you find a lot of generals who sort of regale you with wartime stories, but perhaps few who can actually put that in a framework of learning and then sort of make it contextual. General Menon perhaps belongs to the latter category. So on that note, I want to welcome all of you again. Welcome our friends from the consulate. I see Dave, I see Salil has joined, Abdul is also here. But Alexander, I want to welcome you. USIBC and ISB, we've worked closely for several years now in different aspects, and it's great to sort of reconnect through you as well. And I hope this can be another opportunity for us to do multiple things beyond this this particular session. We've, as Sridhar just mentioned, economics and trade is a very, very important aspect. In fact, that is at the crux of many things that sort of develop. And it's important for us to understand, and who better than you, who's at USIBC, the premier sort of bilateral trade body between India and US, to sort of talk to us. As you know, this is an initiative by ISB, funded by the State Department through the US Consulate General in Hyderabad. And we're having this series of activities on Indo-Pacific, and this one is the first one, day 2 of the first initiative, which is to sort of build capacity building workshop that we're doing for our friends in the media. With those few words, take this opportunity to again welcome all of you, and thank you for sparing your afternoon with us next 2 hours. Thank you very much. Back to you, Sridhar.
Thank you, Guru, for the warm welcome. Friends, the Indian Monetary Fund, International Monetary Fund, in fact, a couple of days ago, it had forecasted that the global growth is going to increase to 6% in 2021, and they also predicted that the crisis, the economic impact is going to reduce and the growth will pick up faster now, which is in fact a good sign. And it projected a growth of 12.5% for India and 6% for US, which is very good. But I strongly feel that such a forecast will not be possible with a strong Indo-Pacific regional cooperation. And with that in the context, I now request the faculty of our second masterclass, Alexander Slater, the Deputy Managing Director for US India Business Council, who will present and interact with you on strategic economic cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. I'll just take 1 minute to briefly introduce him. With a vast gamut of professional experience and skills, including law, finance, global development, international affairs, strategy, communications, Alexander leads the USIBC to grow trade and investments ties between the US and India. In fact, in the past, prior to USIBC, he handled the tough tasks of advising and writing speeches for the World Bank president and worked as senior financial officer in the World Bank Treasury. Earlier, he served as a foreign policy advisor and speechwriter to US Senator Charles Schumer, the current majority leader in the US Senate. In fact, he worked in the city government of New York as an urban fellow also. In fact, he has been his law has been his main forte. And he, in fact, advised as an attorney to a lot of CEOs and senior executives at Fortune 100 companies in matters of white-collar defense, corporate and congressional investigations, and regulatory reviews of foreign investment in the US. In fact, Alexander is an alumnus of top universities in the world. He holds a BA History from Yale University and a JD, that is a Juris Doctor, from Harvard Law School, and an MPhil in International Relations from Oxford, where he was a Commonwealth scholar. Alexander is a true transnational, if I may say so, born in New York City and grew up in Toronto, studied and practiced in many parts of the world, and now we are good to see him in India. So with this introduction, may I request him to take this masterclass. I understand he may take some 20 to 25 minutes and would give more time for interaction. Thank you. Over to you, Alexander.
Thank you, Sudhir. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. So look, I appreciate that warm introduction. Let me just say I'm so happy to be here today and grateful that you thought of me as somebody who could help shed some light and share thoughts on these critical issues with this wonderful group of journalists. I'd also like to say thank you to ISB. Thank you to the US Consulate in Hyderabad for bringing together this group. We're at an important moment in US-India relations, and I think these types of interactions, as I'll speak about later on in the presentation, are critical to getting the relationship right and producing the social and economic benefits I think that both countries are really looking for to improve the lives of their citizens. Let me also start by acknowledging that we are in tough times with rising COVID numbers across the country. I just want to say that I hope everyone is keeping safe and healthy. And I know that it's not easy to focus on work or join these types of conversations when these things are going on around us. So I really appreciate that. And one more note of appreciation, I want to say to all of the folks from the media on this webinar. Every morning I wake up. My spouse is a journalist, I should say that. My sister is a journalist, so I have close ties with the community. Part of the international background that I have, Sudhir didn't touch on it, but I know he's aware of it, is that I'm also married to an Indian national, and so my internationalism expands with each year and has expanded substantially with that union, given the size of India and its cultural diversity. But I should say that every morning we start our day, we have breakfast together, and we read multiple papers across India in print, at least 3 in print, and then of course we're reading online publications as well. And the reason that I am able to do my job, one of the reasons I'm able to do my job, and I think one of the reasons that I'm in a position to be able to share the thoughts that I will today, is because of the work that all of you do. The stories that you write, the information that you track down, what you share publicly, the opinions that you gather, the analysis that you provide, ultimately the stories that you tell shape the world that me and billions of others who read newspapers understand us to live in. And it allows us to see opportunities, identify challenges, and work to make the world a better place. So I just want to say thank you for doing the work that you do. Thank you for producing the information that enables me to do the work that I do. With that, I think we should get started. Okay. So what I've done is, as Slater has said, I think I've prepared a presentation. I haven't really timed it, but I'll just keep it to about 20 minutes. And then we can begin a Q&A. I think that those interaction portions are important and really make these conversations more lively, as all of us spend so much time in front of the computer on Zoom calls and sort of writing or doing research. So without further ado, let me try and share my screen here. I am Alexander Slater, and I'm the Deputy Managing Director of the US-India Business Council. Here is the presentation that I have put together on strategic partnership in the Indo-Pacific region, a business perspective. I know that you're all journalists, so you're familiar with this. These remarks are off the record. These are on background. They're not for attribution. These are my thoughts that I have put together. They don't, represent the official stance of really anyone, even as I've put the US-India Business Council's logo on here. And so please don't quote me on this. They really are not for attribution. I'm trying to be very honest and share my unvarnished thoughts. So I'd be grateful if you could keep this between us. Of course, after this event, if you would like to speak one-on-one or for me to go into more detail or to get sort of on the record discussions, I'd be happy to do that. Sridhar and Guru have my contact information, and I'd be pleased if they would circulate it. Okay, so without further ado, we'll move forward with the presentation. So I know that yesterday you had a conversation on strategic affairs, and I'm sorry that I was unable to join. Actually, it may have been on Wednesday, and I'm sorry that I was unable to join for that. Yesterday, as you all may know, Secretary John Kerry, the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, conducted actually he was here all week. He landed on Monday and he departed today. He was in India all week having meetings, and I was working with colleagues to put together a meeting for him with business leaders to promote US-India cooperation on tackling climate change. And so that really did occupy most of my time. But the good news is that I come with fresh perspectives on climate change and cutting edge information as a result of those conversations. And that will be part of the presentation I make today. This being said, I know you did talk about strategic affairs, but I do think it's important that I also talk about it today, because the strategic landscape really does shape the business context and serve as both a supporter for it or an obstacle to it. And also, when we talk about Indo-Pacific, we really want to be mindful of the fact that we're talking about a specific set of thoughts, a specific set of commitments, okay? So first and foremost, I wanted to talk about what does it mean when we talk about the quote-unquote Indo-Pacific. These days, if you look at the media and the reporting and even the sort of mindset of folks who are in government, what they really are thinking about in a lot of ways is the Quad, right? So India, Japan, Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. And this grouping that originally came out of relief efforts related to the tsunami in the early noughts, then went on hiatus and then was sort of reconstituted, and especially in the last 2 years has gained a lot of momentum as a security cooperation grouping, and then most recently with the first ever meeting of Quad leaders 2 weeks ago, it now has taken on a much deeper dimension related to both security and economics, and security broadly constituted, especially with the initiative for cooperation on vaccines. So we see in a very short time the idea that the Indo-Pacific means the Quad and what the Quad itself is taking part of or is taking awareness of has grown substantially. If you had gone back, I think, prior to the Trump administration and you talked to folks about Indo-Pacific, really, at least in the United States, the awareness would be the change in name of the U.S. Pacific Command to the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. And that's significant because during the Obama administration, traditionally the United States' security alliances have been focused on Europe. And I don't mean to say that there haven't been significant security alliances in East Asia, because there have. U.S. relationships with South Korea and Japan are deep and significant in the security cooperation area. Of course, in the early noughts, a lot of the United States security activity was focused on the Middle East. At the same time, NATO really was this the most advanced form of an alliance, a military alliance that the United States had, and those were with European countries. But again, during the Obama administration, mostly because of the rise of China, but also because of understandings of the vast economic potential for cooperation between the United States and the Indo-Pacific region, not just East Asia, the mindset began to change. And so in addition to the Quad, there are also significant groupings that are covered by the Indo-Pacific area. There's the U.S. traditional alliance dating back to the 1950s with South Korea. There's also the United States' relationship with ASEAN states. These days, those relationships are dominated by efforts to work together to manage China's sort of naval expansion in the South China Sea and related areas. Of course, ASEAN is a complex organization, especially for U.S. relations, and I think increasingly with India, given the political and security events that are taking place in Myanmar right now. There's also Bangladesh and, of course, the larger SAARC region. Bangladesh, the U.S.-India Business Council is an affiliated U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is sort of a major advocacy organization in the United States for the business community. We just launched last week the U.S.-India Bangladesh Business Council, and that's a sign of the rapidly growing economic ties between Bangladesh and the United States, and the steady growth in its economy that Bangladesh has posted over the last 5 years. I know it was a big, it garnered front page headlines earlier this year when Bangladesh's per capita income or per capita GDP reached a level that was similar to India's. So it too is going to become a major player in this Indo-Pacific landscape. And of course, the SAARC region involves, as you all know, other countries: Nepal, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and of course Pakistan, which with the sort of nascent discussions between India and Pakistan on a potential baby steps towards more peaceful relations, really could be a game changer for the entire region. I know that's remote, but as we think about expanding trade and investment ties in the region, SAARC is perhaps globally the most underconnected trade and economic region globally. And so what that might hold for the region and for, frankly, economic cooperation generally could be huge. And then in the background of all of this, of course, is India's historic relationships with Russia and China. I've hinted a bit at sort of the China role here, but just this week, Sergei Lavrov, and ironically, Sergei Lavrov, who is the foreign minister for Russia, and John Kerry, who is effectively the foreign minister for the United States in the Obama administration, were actually in India at the same time, having high-level meetings. And notably, the press indicated that Lavrov refused to even use the words Indo-Pacific when talking about the larger region and the affairs that are taking place here. And so that gives you an idea of what other countries are thinking about when they hear Indo-Pacific, and where they believe their interests lie in terms of relationships between countries and configurations. And again, taking another step back, look, the history matters, and I'm sure that you went over this on Wednesday, so I'll go very quickly. When I see India, when I look at India, I see what is a remarkable achievement for so many reasons. Obviously, its emergence from a colonial occupation, hundreds of years of colonial occupation and export of national wealth in 1947. What it has accomplished in what is going to be 75 years is nothing short of remarkable in my view. It has been a rapid, especially recently in the last 20 years, maybe the last 30 years, a rapid growth in quality of life and the size of the economy, which is a good thing. But India has suffered from what I can only describe as a deeply insecure security arrangement over that entire period. I was born in the United States, I grew up in Canada, and these two countries have what is probably the most secure, unprotected, biggest border in the world. And so for me to come and live in a country where the northern borders on both sides of a country are insecure and constantly, at least from the time that I've been here, sources of violent interaction is something totally new and totally different. And it is something that is totally distracting from the country's ability to focus on its social and economic development. So obviously in 1962, China and India fought a war that was ultimately never settled and is truly at the source of the friction that we see today from the Doklam to the Gawan and parts in between. And then, of course, in 1971, there's been Indo-Pac tension for a long time, ever since partition. But the 1971 war in particular has a resonance these days. Obviously, this 50th anniversary, with the Prime Minister's visit to Bangladesh 2 weeks ago, but also because this war in particular is one that lies at the heart of what I think is the biggest challenge to the growth of the Indo-Pacific and the US-India relationship in particular. I think that what this relationship really is, the only thing that really stands in the way of this relationship is what I call trust issues. And I'm going to get into that. And I think most of those issues stem from 1971. I think there were also some late 90s issues, of course, related to nuclear testing. But I do think that the number one issue in the minds of policymakers these days is what happened in 1971, where the United States, at least India perceives that the United States, in an effort to get closer to China, deserted India in a time of need and supported an embargo that really complicated India's efforts to help East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, find its sovereignty, and for India itself to sort of repel border hostilities with Pakistan during that time. And so this trauma is sort of in the kind of Indian foreign policy makers' mindsets, like, can I trust the United States? This traumatic incident really does play a role today, because we are at another point where obviously relations between India and China are at a low point. The United States and China are at a deeply a deep freeze, as it were, or a highly contentious period. But they're bound together by deep economic ties, and so I think that people in India are wary of, as the U.S. and India work to get much closer, and this is something that I am strongly supportive of and believe in. Some, I think, in India think, well, could what happened in 1971 happen again? If the U.S. and China are able to find some way out of the current situation. So let me go to the next slide, which is, we have trust issues. And I think I got into them earlier. When you talk about the Indo-Pacific generally, I do think that the U.S.-India relationship is a driver of the momentum in the Indo-Pacific right now, and that's mostly because the U.S. has long-standing and strong relationships with regional powers like Japan, Australia, and Korea. I talked a little bit about the security relationships between Japan and Korea that date back to World War II in the case of Japan, and then the 1950s with Korea and Australia. There's been ties for some time, and those really took on an accelerated military dimension in the early noughts, when during the Obama, or in late noughts, when the Obama administration actually began to station troops in Australia, as well as these other two countries. So again, the major obstacle, in my view, to close U.S. cooperation today is trust. We talked a little bit about the 1971. From a U.S. perspective, India has strong military ties with a U.S. adversary in Russia, and I think that complicates the pace, at least, at which the U.S. and India can take on closer military cooperation. I think it's also one of the reasons why you see different language being used by both the U.S. and India when they talk about the Quad. I think India studiously avoids talking about the Quad as a military alliance, talking about it as something that is like NATO, because they know that Russian perceptions of NATO are very negative. I do think that the United States, if that aspect were not part of this equation, would be pushing for something closer to a stronger military alliance. So there's that. In addition, from the Indian perspective, there are domestic laws in the United States that really create complications for it. We saw this in 2019 when India had to stop oil imports from Iran. And this continues to be an ongoing issue related to defense systems, specifically India's acquisition from Russia of the S-400 anti-aircraft system. So, there are issues on both sides. And we see that this trust deficit comes into play also in the economic realm. The two sides during the Trump administration couldn't seal even a mini trade deal, which is worth a fraction of the bilateral trade between the two countries. As of the end of 2019, that bilateral trade was equal to $150 billion and had grown significant amounts in the last 5 years prior to that, even in the absence of a trade and investment accords. And yet they couldn't agree on a free trade deal that would have covered for both sides $12 billion worth of trade. And that I think is a sign of trust issues, quite frankly, between the two sides. But look, despite these challenges, I think there's a tremendous amount going for the two countries. We have a relationship that is very rich in what I would call trust assets. The two leaders, both Biden and Modi, talked a lot about how we're both democracies and the cultural affinity that comes from that. I think you also saw President Biden last month in a very funny interaction with folks at NASA after the landing of the most recent rover on Mars, talk about how Indian Americans are taking over his administration because so many of them have prominent roles. And this is not just the case in terms of the public sector or the national level in the United States. We also see that obviously in the corporate sector with so many Indian origin people serving as CEOs of major companies. We had this with Pepsi, with Ingenuity. We now have it today with companies like IBM, Google, MasterCard. MasterCard is formerly, but was MasterCard, and now Microsoft. So that's a big deal, in the United States, where Americans see Indian Americans or people of Indian origin playing such a prominent role in U.S. society and doing so well there. On the other side, there's also America's soft power. I think the cultural appeal of the United States remains extremely strong around the world. I do think that in the prior administration, that took a bit of a hit because there was this tougher approach to economic relations than had been taken in the past. But that I don't think that dents the idea that people still see the United States these days, especially on a relative basis, as a place of economic mobility, as a place of personal freedom, and a place where people can sort of speak their mind and pursue their dreams. I'm mindful that the United States itself has lots of its own challenges. Many of them came out during the election and immediately after the election. I'm not trying to downplay that, but I do think that people's idea of the United States still, on balance, remains a positive one, especially relative to other regimes in the world, and that's a trust asset. And finally, the U.S. and China are basically neck and neck for being India's top trading partner, and that's a major trust asset, because I think people in India see that commercial relationships with those two countries are a great way to advance the social and economic development of India. And then, of course, there's a strategic alignment between our two countries. There's obviously India-China tension, U.S.-China tensions, but there are also sort of concrete ways that our two countries are aligning in the strategic realm. India was named the major defense partner of the United States in 2016. Since that time, has entered into 3 foundational defense agreements that accelerate procurement and military integration, especially when it comes to communications and data sharing. These lay the foundation for much deeper ties in terms of military sales and industrial collaboration on defense assets. And we see that there already are ongoing, increasingly long-tenured military activities involving not just the US and India, but this year the Malabar exercises included all 4 of the Quad members, with Australia joining. And then we also see that the security cooperation has expanded beyond defense to key areas like vaccines. India is going to be a major producer of 2 US created vaccines, one being the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. I think that the media reports today indicate that the bridge trials in India will begin very soon. And then ultimately, I know that the Serum Institute of India has entered into a sort of understanding with Novavax that once that vaccine receives regulatory approval, it too will be produced here. So you really do see on key areas of military security, not just defense, the two countries really aligning their industrial bases. So why do commercial ties matter to basically overcoming our trust issues and leveraging our trust assets? I hinted at this before, that the way to translate our trust assets and strong sort of social ties and align strategic interests into social and economic benefit is through closer trade and investment cooperation. And so this is a forum where we can take an inclusive approach to generating benefits from these trust assets. There's a lot of discussion in the United States, and I also know here in India about, in the United States, we talk about inclusive economic growth, not simply economic growth, because the United States is battling an increasing challenge with economic inequality. And in India, there's been a long-time focus, for a variety of reasons, on poverty reduction. We see a lot of that debate here focused on raising farmers' incomes and economic measures to do that. Closer trade and investment ties are the ways to address these problems. I think too often we have looked at globalization as, initially globalization was deemed to be a silver bullet for dealing with these issues, but while it did create substantial economic benefits globally, we see many export-oriented countries in East Asia in particular were able to rise out of mass poverty by pursuing strongly globalized policies. There have also been effects of globalization that have promoted larger inequality. And so the idea here is to build stronger commercial ties between our countries that minimize those inequalities and maximize the benefits that come from these relationships. I'd also say that commercial ties matter because they help us overcome trust deficits or trust issues, because they're both an accelerant and a ballast. In good times, the business community can be a powerful advocate and driver of a deeper relationship. I know this because that's what I do every day. The US Chamber of Commerce, the US India Business Council, we work with public officials in both India and the United States at the national and state levels across the countries, sharing with them the opportunities that there are from building closer trade and investment ties between the two countries. And every day we are interacting with officials, trying to figure out how is it that we can bring our two countries into closer alignment and drive closer cooperation. So this is something that I live each day in my job. I should also say that in tough times, when there are moments of disagreements at official levels, the commercial community acts as a ballast to restrain activities, or to make sure that in dealing with these differences, politicians and bureaucrats are careful in how they go about working to resolve them. The commercial ties create incentives or carrots for maintaining their relationship, and illustrate drawbacks or costs, sticks from decoupling. You see this particularly right now in China. I think that there's no doubt, had the US and China had a less close commercial relationship over the last 20, that has been built up over the last 20 years, that the relationship between the two countries would be as good as it is today. Decoupling between those two economies is going to be a very delicate task. I don't know that it's actually going to happen. I do know that there's going to be substantial diversification. I think most of the world has seen that, whatever they think of China, the pandemic has illustrated the challenges that come from one country serving as the world's, having a too large, effectively, a portion of the world's manufacturing capacity, and has nothing to do with what you think of the country or its government. It has more just to do with, if there is a risk that arises from that country and you can no longer get access to its assets, i.e. the manufacturing base of China, what impact does that have on the rest of the world? And so, what we're seeing these days is sort of regionalization of supply chains. Mexico is becoming where countries, effectively markets, are trying to bring supply chains closer. You'll see this with Mexico in particular in the United States. But this can be a really scalpel approach rather than a scattershot approach. And what I mean by that is, the idea of creating trusted supply chains between India and the United States, which I'll get to later in the presentation, is very, very powerful. You could see that American companies that want to access markets in Asia could see a way to diversify risk by investing in India and using India as a manufacturing base for their exports to those markets. So look, now that I've sort of laid out where we are and why commercial ties matter, let's think about how we can move forward. Look, our goals are largely aligned. I think both countries want to promote prosperity for their people and social development. And the history shows, data shows, this is something that the World Bank has done lots of studies on. That sustainable, inclusive economic growth and job creation are the most powerful drivers to deliver these outcomes. We both have comparative advantages that allow us to work well together. India has a large and fast-growing market. It's a services powerhouse given the size of its population, young population, and the sort of high level of education among what is relatively a small group of people, but still a very large number of people in aggregate. Especially when it comes to software engineering, electrical engineering, things like that. And it's also a low-cost manufacturer. you see some really innovative ways in India for delivering high-level services for low cost. We see this, in mobile telecommunications. I like to talk to my friends at home these days about that I can walk into a local diagnostic storefront and get a COVID test for 800 rupees, RT-PCR test for 800 rupees, which in the United States is about a little over $10, and get the result within 24 hours. And it's been like that here in India for, I would say at least 3 to 4 months now. When in the United States, a COVID test is much more expensive, up to 10 times that amount. And you don't get, depending on the capacity available, it can take 2 to 3 days or a week to get the result back, which largely sort of defeats the purpose of getting a test. So there are really some innovative things that India has done with the delivery of cutting-edge services that make it something to be proud of the way of its capacity. The United States also has a very large, in fact, the largest market in the world by GDP, even as it is quite competitive. It has very deep capital markets and significant technical expertise. And these are things I think that are very attractive to India. The US-India Business Council is not just a membership organization of US companies seeking to do business in India. We also have a number of significant Indian members who want to do business in the United States. That too is an asset of Indian companies, this entrepreneurial mentality, this desire to want to compete in global markets rather than just to stay at home or to kind of go to the markets that are closest by and are low-hanging fruit. We see no shortage among our members at Indian companies of wanting to go to the United States, invest there, and compete. And I think that's actually a wonderful attribute, and that mindset, that cultural approach, really speaks volumes about India's capacity and its future. So finally, as I said this before, the trust issues that we do have slow the translation of this potential into concrete benefits for both countries. So I'm going to show you really an American perspective now on where areas are for growth going forward between our two economies as the driver of the Indo-Pacific relationship, and then where I think there are areas of concern. So the top four, I think, are energy, infrastructure, and climate change as sort of one grouping, digital economy, manufacturing, and healthcare. This is gleaned from the intelligence that I get every day from the people I work with. Some of it is shaped from the conversations we had yesterday with Secretary Kerry and the business leaders that were in the room there. There's going to be a lot of potential for our countries to work together on renewable energy supply chains, whether it's the manufacture of solar panels, with the government putting forth policies like the product-linked incentive for the production of photovoltaic cells, to components for electric vehicles. This is going to be a real area of cooperation over the next 10 to 15 years. On infrastructure, India's appetite for infrastructure is enormous. The infrastructure pipeline that the government has put forward, its efforts to monetize the assets that it currently has in the most recent budget to generate capital for further investment, and its aggressive courting of international investors, especially pension funds in the United States, to devote capital here. It creates a real opportunity for the two countries to work together to answer that infrastructure need that India is looking for. On the digital economy side, I think that this is sort of well known to folks. The United States has an incredible research and development capacity in science and technology, and India has immense human capital in the software and startup space. And bringing those two together through collaborations, through the supply of private equity capital, which you see every day. I think in the last week, 2 or 3 or maybe more companies in India have gotten valuations that make them unicorns as a result of private equity investments from US investors, show how this is driving the growth of commercial ties between our two countries. In terms of manufacturing, we think that there will be a lot of opportunity for closer defense industrial work. as a result of the major defense partner designation and the foundational agreements that I alluded to earlier. The real question is, are we going to be able to sort out the regulatory issues on the US side that would enable India and India's industrial base to serve as a component manufacturer for sensitive systems? We see this as possible in NATO countries. Are we going to be able to get to a certain arrangement like that between the US and India? I'm hopeful and optimistic that we are. I know this is something that we are considering as a priority to allow sort of India become part of that value chain in a greater way. And then, more recently, I think everybody is feeling the impact of the semiconductor shortage in the world that is arising out of the huge pent-up demand for electronics and the sort of spread of electronics across the economy, especially in the automotive area. I'm trying to buy a car. My spouse and I moved here 18 months ago. We don't have a car, but now we need to get a car. And I had the major factor in me deciding which car to buy here in India has been how long will it take for me to get the car, because the wait can be anywhere from 6 weeks to 3 months. And we want a car now, and much of that is the result of a lack of access to semiconductors that power the electronics within the vehicle. And then finally, healthcare is a great opportunity for us to collaborate. A lot of our medical device companies already manufacture in India, and obviously India has this wonderful world-class vaccine production capacity. The most recent budget showed that India is about to massively ramp up its spending on healthcare. It is, I think, the single biggest increase in terms of sector-wise in the budget, and there'll be lots of opportunities for the U.S. companies to supply cutting-edge solutions to India and to help grow the healthcare infrastructure in this country. That being said, to kind of capitalize on these growth areas, there are things that we're going to have to overcome. The major, I think, issue is globalization versus Indianization. This is an issue that I think the jury is still out on what is it that the Modi government is doing. I think there's a lot of confusion over what Atmanirbhar Bharat means. What does it mean to be self-reliant versus an export-oriented economy? I don't think that's clear. A case study from this comes from the recent public procurement order that the government has put out by the Ministry of Commerce, but implemented by different agencies in their own way based on their procurement needs versus the product incentive program. So as some of you may know, the government of India, as part of its economic stimulus and structural reform packages in response to the pandemic, has identified 10 areas where it will effectively provide subsidies to manufacturers to set up manufacturing facilities in this country in specific cutting-edge industries like battery storage, photovoltaic cells, solar panels, high-tech electronics, food processing, etc., to expand India's base in those areas. And there's sort of like the subsidies will increase for the amount of manufacturing you do up to a certain amount on a time-limited, time-bound basis, sort of over the next 5 years. That's a really powerful way to attract an incentive to attract foreign companies to invest in India, to set up shop here, and to integrate India into global regional value chains, because India can then become, in addition to sort of creating an industrial base in those areas and promoting knowledge transfer for Indian startups and new opportunities for MSMEs in India to sell to these this new industrial base. It also is a sort of a positive way of framing that. Whereas the public procurement order is something that many of our members have responded to negatively, because it's being implemented differently across the government, because each ministry is implementing it differently. There's lots of confusion over what the direction from the Ministry of Commerce means, and effectively it limits the opportunities for our companies to sell to the government, even in the case of the manufacture of those items in India. And this is sort of really the challenge, because you have the government itself, or at least the policies or our companies, perceiving that the way the government's own policies for purchasing goods are being implemented undermine or don't really recognize that they are making in India. And that's a big problem. And so, we need to find a way to solve this. You also see this in two other areas in terms of technical standards and data governance. Technical standards are things like 5G, for example. There are global bodies where the world comes together to figure out how are we going to implement sort of global regulatory approaches or policy approaches to cross-border economic issues. And India has often said, look, we're different, and we are a very large economy, we're a smaller economy, and a very large population, a growing economy, but we have our own needs because of the relative low per capita income in our country. So, how do you integrate? How do you make this something that reflects what we want? And India needs to sort of let go of going its own way and take part more in being part of a global approach. On data governance, this is about data localization, where the government of India is asking for data that is generated in India to be stored in India, and that creates all kinds of issues related to companies that have made investments for data storage outside of the country, even if they make that data available or have mirrors of those data sets in the country. There's also level playing field issues for competition, where firms that are effectively incorporated in India, employ people in India, invest in India, but are deemed to be foreign firms versus local firms, are subject to different regulatory structures. We really see this in the finance and insurance space. For example, in the banking sector, there are different taxation amounts on branches of what are considered foreign bank branches and local bank branches, even though, again, they're employing Indians in those branches in the country. There's also issues related to intellectual property rights, where US companies in particular, but also many other foreign firms, see that their ability to defend those property rights in India and have those rights recognized is problematic, and therefore that makes them hesitant to invest. And then finally, at the state level, look, Indian state governments play an hugely important role. I don't know what the data is, but I think that if you looked at the 10 largest Indian states, they're probably larger than, I don't know, let's say 100 countries in the world individually. And so what these governments do and their decisions are incredibly consequential. And so some of the things that we have found in dealing with them, even as many of them are working aggressively to ease doing business in those states and attract more investment, and are making great strides in that area. I want to be complimentary and recognize their accomplishments. Sometimes we see them favoring local contractors, and I put local in quotes because the firms that they are either forcing to no longer be subcontractors on projects, or to sort of take away previously awarded bids from, are, again, for all intents and purposes, Indian companies, because they are incorporated here, they pay taxes here, and they employ people here on those projects. There's also a late payment issue. I think that's an issue that's faced by both Indian companies and effectively foreign firms that are doing business here and doing business with the government, and then also sort of canceling tenders after work has already begun. So look, I think I went way longer than I expected, so I'm going to stop here now. I know we may actually be at the end of our time, and I'm so sorry about that. But if you do have any questions, I'd love to answer them.
Yeah. Thank you, Alexander, for that wonderful perspective. In fact, giving us the political economy perspective of the Indo-US, Indo-Pacific cooperation, and by talking about the trust deficit and trust asset issues. So, in fact, I liked when you said commercial ties create carrots for maintaining a relationship and sticks for decoupling it. It's really good. The floor is now open for a couple of questions. I'm afraid we don't have too much of time, but maybe we can pick up a couple of questions. Can anyone has?
I have a question.
Sure. Can you briefly introduce?
I'm Rekha Dixit from the Week magazine in Delhi.
Okay.
And my question is, you spoke very beautifully about these, the distrusts we have. There are lots of them, right? And one of the biggest things, which is a total no-go for India, is when America starts getting very high on its moral high ground and pointing fingers at our lack of democracy and our human rights violations and stuff like that. And these are kind of issues that really rankle Indian the policymaker, the government more than the policymakers. Do you think America needs to tone down on these things? I mean, talking about trade and talking about other things, those kind of wariness is going to stay for some time. It's not going to be wished away, especially because we do have ties with Russia. And, so that is going to be a tightrope. But here at least, can't America, look at its own, house instead of, happily commenting on others?
So I'll say this. I think that, I think I said this in my own presentation, that the U.S., the run up to the U.S. election and, events in January showed that the United States does have real issues internally. I think everyone knows this. The Biden administration is very well aware of it. These date back to fissures that the United States, that relate to the founding of the United States, and slavery, that was effectively codified in the Constitution, but that over time the United States has worked to overcome and has a lot more work to do. So let me just say that by starting now. But on the point you raised, I think it's important to sort of think or reflect back on the interaction, that high-level interaction in Alaska between senior foreign policy officials from the United States and China when the Defense Secretary Secretary Austin was here in India visiting. This very question was effectively tossed by Chinese diplomats at the United States, right? Don't come after us when you talk about things like Xinjiang. Focus on your own house. You have your own problems, right? And I thought that the Secretary of State of the United States really illustrated what the United States policy is going to be and why. Whether you agree with that or not, I'm sort of stating here what I think is going to happen. And he said, we're well aware of the issues that we have with inequality, with racial justice in our country. And it's actually really worth going and finding out a transcript of what he said, because he was very powerful and eloquent when he said it. These are things that we talk about in our country. These are things that we acknowledge in our country. In fact, many people think that this past election was about those issues and was an endorsement of talking about those issues and directly addressing them and fixing them. I think the issues that what the United States is going to do is that approach is part of the cultural mindset of Americans. And so that will be part of an American foreign policy under a Biden administration. He was saying, we're not going to shy away from criticism about our own house. We're here to take it and we're here to focus on it and remedy it. But we're not going to shy away from talking about it in other places where we see it to exist. And this is something that the two countries are going to have to manage in our relationship, because I don't think that you're going to see it going away.
Okay. Thank you. Naveen, you have a question?
Yeah, my question is, this is Naveen Garawal from the Tribune. I'm the Chief of Bureau for South India. My question is that, India is already having a lot of issues with China. There are a lot of trust deficit issues there. And with India actually having, greater cooperation with the United States, including defense and now business and things like that, how does the US see India-China relationship in light of this new development?
I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Could you maybe say that?
I'm trying to understand how the US views the developments vis-a-vis the Indo-US improvement in relationships in relation to India's relationship with China.
Got it. Okay, great.
Your perspective on that.
Great question. I got it. So look, I love the previous question too, Ms. Dixit. It's a that's a question I think has been talked about a lot, and is also a great question. This one, look, I think the United States sees this as an amazing opportunity. This is the biggest. Look, there are reasons that they're both push and what I call push and pull reasons for India to embrace closer relations with the United States, right? The pull reasons are it's a great way to accelerate India's own development, right? Through access to capital, through access to technical know-how, and also, really some attractions to the idea of the United States, if not the reality, right? This is the soft power issues that I was talking about. The push issues are certainly tensions with China. I think that there are also sort of, if I might say it, some technical issues related to defense material that was procured from non-US countries and how they've operated when they've been, pushed to the limit of real engagements, where they haven't worked as India would have wanted. And so the access to higher quality goods, even if they're quite expensive, is also very attractive. And so, from again, the way I see the U.S.-India relationship from a strategic perspective is that the United States is willing to run as fast as India will let it. And so really, India is the one who is controlling the pace at which this relationship will grow closer. And there was some, this relates back to the original question where some folks thought, if there was a Biden administration, you had seen, even under Trump, that with things that had happened with Article 370, and then sort of communal issues in India, and then internet freedom issues, that the Democrats, at least in Congress, were raising these issues with Indian counterparts and with the Indian officials in the United States. Would they get in the way of closer U.S.-India relations? I think you've seen that they haven't, right? The United States is saying things about these issues, but the Quad is expanding, and it's expanding rapidly, right? The thing to focus on is the Quad is now deeply focused on strategic, 4 working groups on climate, vaccines, healthcare, and strategic issues. So, and they're sort of institutionalized groupings to take cooperation forward in these areas. So, even as these, and again, it's India from my perspective that continues to resist talking about the Quad as an alliance, as a military grouping. So you sort of see that. I think the United States would run as fast as India would let it in terms of an embrace.
Thank you, Alexander.